Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British whale critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains! And today, we are going to discuss several locomotives that clearly were designed for no other reason than for the purposes of unspeakable, God-playing mad science. These are 5 trains that are clearly just mad science experiments. The Erie Railroad Triplex locomotive. Now, I've discussed triplexes in the past, and there's a reason why they were not very popular. And for one thing, look at that. Look at all those wheels, all those cylinders, all this unyielding power. And yet, they never really were very good. And many wonder why. After all, duplexes are a thing. They totally work. And simple articulates work. But it seems like when it comes to a single boiler anyway, once you go past 2, things get really complicated. These locomotives were incredibly good for banking because when they did move, they were insanely powerful. And when these were introduced in 1914, they were believed to be the heaviest and most powerful steam locomotives in the world. The problem with them was that going off of a single boiler, no matter how large it was, trying to get steam to all the cylinders was basically impossible. So getting them up to a point where they could actually move was incredibly difficult, and even when they did move, they were never going to be very fast. They weren't considered successful at all, and no more were built. And much like the other triplexes, they were either scrapped or rebuilt into smaller, more conventional locomotives. But as I mentioned before, there were plans to create a quadruplex locomotive, and at one point Union Pacific did draw up plans to create the hexaplex locomotive. That's right, 6 sets of driving wheels. This was never built. Because, no, just stop, okay? It's not going to work. It didn't work at 3, why would it work going even bigger? Just add more driving wheels, that's fine. Just add all the driving wheels in the universe. It'll be okay. Eventually it'll be so big that it has to work. But that's the price of mad science. And perhaps you yourself have been sitting there, wishing dearly to create your own mad science experiment. Well, I'm happy to inform you about today's sponsor! Want to learn something? Want to learn something right now, in the comfort of your own home? Then give Skillshare a shot. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for anyone who loves learning and wants to explore their creativity and learn new skills. Invest in yourself and your personal growth. Have a specific skill you're trying to learn? Skillshare is the perfect place to start. From photography and illustration to graphic design, freelancing, and more, you can find classes that will match your goals and interests. I, myself, have a deep interest in 3D modeling, and admittedly, I've never been very good at it. But given I'm doing history stuff now, and it'd be really cool if I could someday, 3D model the locomotives and planes and helicopters and everything I talk about, well, Skillshare gave me great access to multiple classes, including an excellent one by Southern Shoddy 3D, who gave me excellent tips and tricks for how to use the free 3D modeling software, Blender. And this is something any of you could easily access right now. And in fact, I'll do you one better. Not only is Blender free, but the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get 1 month free of Skillshare, so you can try it out for yourself, and maybe learn a thing or two. So invest in yourself over at Skillshare. The Johnston geared locomotives. Geared steam locomotives usually fall into a few categories, and the most well-known ones include the Shay, definitely, the Climaxes, or the Heislers. But all the way over in New Zealand in 1910, they introduced their own design for a geared steam locomotive, and look at all those tiny wheels. Admittedly, the white notation for this is somewhat debatable, as some will tell you that it's a 2-2-2-2-2-2-2-2, 8 twos, 8 pairs of driving wheels, so 16 wheels total, or it could also possibly be a 22 plus 22 plus 22 plus 22. Either way, that's a lot of wheels. A lot of really tiny, tiny wheels. Why were they so small? Well, it's probably to reduce the overall weight. See, the whole point of this particular design was that each axle would only have about 1 ton of weight on it total, because these locomotives actually ran on wooden rails. Much like other geared locomotives, it was designed for rural work, like logging for example. And believe it or not, they were actually pretty successful. They aren't very well known, but they definitely worked, and were in continued use in New Zealand for many decades, but by the 50s they were obsolete, and not a single one was preserved. Kinda sad, because they're definitely a unique piece. The Krupp-Zoelly Condensing Turbine Locomotive. Okay, that was clearly created by a supervillain. Which country is this one? Of course it was. This is one of the German outings for a steam turbine locomotive. The turbine could produce 2,000 horsepower at 6,800 RPM and actually operated in 3 separate stages. It was interesting and definitely looked just so steampunk. That is so steampunk. This is the most steampunk thing I've ever seen in my life. But as we previously mentioned when we talked about steam turbine locomotives, they just aren't efficient at low speeds. At high speeds they're great, but locomotives have to go slow sometimes. They have to stop. And whenever they're idling, the turbines just eat fuel like crazy. It's very difficult to make them economical. This one was numbered T18-1001, and like pretty much every steam turbine locomotive, it did not survive into preservation, although in this case it was because of World War II. It was hit by a bomb in 1940 and scrapped. The Swiss EB3/5. Okay, that just looks ridiculous. What is going on? What is the deal with the why? Why? Switzerland, why? I'm all for mad science, but this just looks bizarre. Only one of these was ever produced, and the reason for those 2 overhangs in the front is they were designed to protect the firebox's air intakes, which sit below them, probably from snow. After all, it was Switzerland. This is a tank engine, and it is a high-pressure steam locomotive. Oh yes, just like the Fury, just like the Hush Hush, this one was designed to operate at 850 psi. And its feed water was actually preheated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit by the exhaust steam of the main cylinders and the feed pump. It definitely had some thought put into it, and in trials it actually performed very well. The problem they were worried about was safety. After all, it's high pressure, 850 psi. Like any steam engine, it suffered from scale deposits, most of which deposited in the feed water heater. Now this was on purpose, that's where they wanted it to deposit, but some was starting to form in the boiler tubes, and this was insanely dangerous. At the time, the builders said they had a fix for it, but after it went in for refurbishment, it was never seen again. So it's likely their fix simply didn't work, and the locomotive was likely scrapped sometime after that. The Lübeck Buchanan Eisenbahn Gesellschaft Steam Motor Locomotive. Ooh, that name even sounds cool. I love it. This interesting tank engine is not all it appears to be. It has a bizarre cab, for one, and the final product was supposed to be completely streamlined and self-contained. It's actually a modification of an older locomotive, the 1CH2G6, which was originally built in 1913. This modification was applied to it in 1936 because they were testing the potential of steam motor technology. Now, steam motors are not quite the same as a traditional steam engine. They are in the loosest of senses, but the motors are just that. They're motors, engines. They're miniaturized versions of steam engines. The motors would be positioned in a way that would cause them to individually power 3 driving axles. The leading and rear axles were driven by 2 motors on the left of the engine, and the middle axle was driven by the motor on the right. This setup was wildly experimental, as steam motors don't generally get used on this scale. After all, the whole point of them is to miniaturize steam technology. Why wouldn't you just use a normal steam engine in this practice? But the thought was that more direct drive could also potentially be more efficient. But the truth is, this locomotive doesn't seem to have gotten very far. See, by the end of 1937, LBE received the news that they would be put under state control on the 1st of January 1938, under the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Under the state, they actually intended the locomotives still be completed, but the motors for the engine were never delivered. World War II took priority very soon after that, and it's not known what happened to the locomotive, but it's likely it was eventually scrapped. And of course a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Brightline Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, and Lock Kraken. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.